There was a time when ground beef ruled the dinner table, stuffed in molds, hidden in Jell-O, or baked into casseroles that could scare off a modern appetite. These ground beef recipes were once dinner-time staples, and now, no one makes them anymore. Let's change that. Beef fudge is almost everything it sounds like. It's a fascinating historical recipe that's almost a bit surprising to hear when you first learn about it. For the medieval period, though, it made a lot of sense. It's not really like the chocolate fudge sundaes we're used to today. Beef fudge was a wartime dish that used animal fat like tallow or ground beef that had been very finely made to make a sweet treat. Now, how did it do that? Well, they put in cocoa powder, sugar, blended the meat with honey and nuts, and had warm spices thrown in there, which were typically always used for more sweet dishes. In execution, it felt like a hybrid between the texture of a traditional fudge and the flavor notes of pemmican. Still, this dish didn't last. By the middle of the 20th century, sweetly flavored meat desserts just weren't doing well. It wasn't appealing, especially as people began to explore more and more of European and French cuisine, becoming obsessed with trying new wine-based wonders in their food. Eventually, beef fudge faded very much into obscurity, but it's definitely one of those things that's very interesting and fun to make every once in a while. The good thing about the fudge was that it could be made using whatever sweet flavors you would like. Banana meatloaf is an incredibly practical recipe that emerged from times where frugality was almost as much of a virtue as cleanliness. Rationing, resourcefulness, and economic hardship were how everyone was getting by. And this was only more true during the worst parts of the Great Depression and World War II. Home cooks were forced to work with very few ingredients, and the typical banana meatloaf recipe was something that was very bare bones and required little prep work or elaborate lists of ingredients to create. All you needed for this was pork mixed with mashed ripe bananas. Throw in some breadcrumbs, which could be repurposed from stale bread, onions, which most people were already stocking up on or growing, and basic seasonings like pepper, nutmeg, and salt, and you had yourself a pretty all-right dish. The banana worked as a binder and a natural sweetener, and it would often work really well with Worcestershire sauce, believe it or not. It helped balance out the incredible sweetness of ripe bananas. This dish did particularly well in Hawaii, where it was appreciated for blending in with already existing preferences. In the 1960s, there was a rising demand for all sorts of experimentative casserole recipes. One of those happened to beef and peanut butter casseroles, and before you exit the video, hear me out. Beef and peanut butter casserole is a fascinating example of how people can get really creative when the stakes are high. This is a dish that has its roots in Great Depression thrifting and ingenuity. If you think it sounds really unusual, you're right, but you're also probably only thinking about this from a flavor perspective instead of what it can do for your body. Most people realized that the protein potential of this was off the charts. It combined peanut butter, which was already carrying loads of the stuff with beef, and it was a meal that could be stretched out to feed an entire family. Plus, despite how we regularly associate peanut butter with sweeter confections, it's actually been something that's constantly thrown into savory recipes too. This was a casserole that emerged all the way in the 1930s or 1940s, but peaked in the 60s. And this was because it was only in those early decades that peanut butter even began to be commonly available in most people's homes. It's got a lot in common with some Thai peanut beef dishes too. Stuffed prune meatballs are a really good example of sweet-savory cooking. This was something you would see commonly throughout both Europe and America, and that was doubly true if we're talking about the 19th and 20th centuries. This was a dish that was a mix of prunes with one of three different kinds of meats. People would either use beef, pork, or veal. And after the meat had been softened to the point it could be shaped and pressed into a meatball, prunes would be stuffed inside them. Some people were a bit freakier than others and would shove an entire prune up there, but some would chop it first. While this might seem like an innovative idea, it's actually not all that new. Dried fruit and meat combinations, especially sweet and savory ones, are really old ideas. They go back all the way to several different cultures present in Europe. You'll find them in Scandinavian, British, Jewish, and German cultures, and if you go on over to Asia, you will still find many sweet and savory combinations. This was a dish that did really well in the 20th century, especially whenever there were Jewish holidays, but over time, the American palate started to settle down with what was familiar instead of stuff like this. It couldn't really last and compete with regular meatballs. Hamburger upside-down pie is really one that's for people who like to experiment with their food. It has a lot of practical thought put into it, but somebody clearly had a lot of fun making this. You take ground beef, and then you take the concept of a baked pie, and what do you get when you mix those two together? A layer of seasoned ground beef packed beautifully at the bottom of a baking dish, laden with onions, tomato sauce, biscuit crumbs, and a cornbread topping. This pie would be baked and then flipped upside down so the bottom layer of beef was the first thing you had, and it was filling enough to feed your entire family and then some. This dish was a part of resourceful home cooking, and it makes me agree with something I saw earlier. It said that being bored is actually good for you because it brings out your creativity. I think that people had so little to work with in these times that they were for once thinking genuinely outside of the box, and sometimes that led to some actual eureka moments, and other times it was fun, little interactive dishes like this. While it wasn't remembered much, it was still a pretty convenient meal that you could even freeze for later if you weren't feeling like eating it all in one go. Understandably, because this is a behemoth to take down on your own. If you're a fan of retro cooking, though, this is a good place to start. Those interesting casseroles don't just end with peanut butter. Next on our list, we're going to be dealing with beef and grape casserole, which is an example of mid-century American cooking really leaving no stone unturned. It was a combination of flavors that was pretty unexpected. Most people think that this dish came out around the 1940s to the 1960s, and that makes sense. Fruit-based experimentation with your typical average Sunday meals was a lot more common. What was interesting was the influences for this dish. Swedish meatballs with lingonberries was another thing that was growing really popular as a recipe for home cooks, and a lot of Americans tried to come up with their own spin-offs of recipes like this. Typically, it had ground or cubed beef, and this was browned with onions. Then, it would be combined with grape jelly or entire grapes, and a sauce would be made for the broth. Tomato paste or Worcestershire sauce would also go in this broth, and some versions also used canned mushroom soup and sour cream to help create a more velvety texture. While the dish was definitely really ambitious and set out to accomplish a lot of bold, difficult-to-work-with flavors, it ended up not really lasting past the 60s. It seems like that one decade was an isolated incident as far as casseroles were considered. Still, is this something you would like to try? Or do you like your grapes on a separate plate from your meat? Mock turtle soup is something that I'm dead sure you would not have seen coming. See, it's something that came out of 18th century England as a substitute for real turtle soup, which, by the way, was insanely popular in these times. People used to actually consider it something of a delicacy. During the Georgian and Victorian eras, green turtle soup would have sea turtles in it, and it was an incredibly prized dish popular among the local aristocracy. Before you crack a nice little cutting-edge joke about how British cuisine is the strangest thing on the planet, this was also popular in American high society, and it's something that got us through the Depression. That's right, mock turtle soup was something that people would make as much as they could when real turtles weren't around or were too expensive. Now, real turtle meat is known for having an incredibly rich and gelatinous broth. The key to mock turtle soup was just to start with the head of a calf or an oxtail, boil it down with a blend of vegetables like carrots, celery, and onions and a spice rub, and slow cooking it. Next, once all the natural collagen was extracted, people would usually add in wine or sherry or Madeira, and this was really common in traditional turtle soup. It replicates the texture of the actual turtle meat, and cooks would try very hard to get that down right. It's one of the most interesting pieces of mock food culture we have, and it shows how good people got at imitating different kinds of foods without the core ingredients. Meat Jell-O, or more commonly known as aspic, is one of the best creations to ever come out of Western culinary history. In this entire list, we have a growing pattern of people mixing gelatinous textures alongside sweet and savory flavors. and this dish was arguably the ultimate culmination of that entire trend. So aspic was actually something that people usually associated with fine dining. It was also used to encase these fancy poached meats which were sometimes imported, plus the thing just looked really fancy. Starts to make sense when you think about it. The early 20th century saw it turning into more of a generalized thing, though. The bizarre evolution of meat Jell-O was really defined by commercialized powdered gelatin and canned soups, which meant that home cooks now had all the tools they needed to make as many aspic-based wonders as they wanted. It's still pretty hot today, comparatively. Beef stuffed donuts are a really bizarre thing to think about. They actually have been a part of tradition for so long. What tradition, you might ask? Well, savory fried dough dishes have been pretty consistently popular across America, believe it or not. Just look at all the meat pies we have. Unlike today's sweet donuts topped with chocolate frosting and red velvet, though, these were a popular way to make some portable food that also filled you up. Different versions of meat-filled fried donuts looked like beef mixed with onions and garlic, or gravy, or even cheese on the inside. So why did something so good disappear? Well, it's just hard to keep up with all the different things the world had to offer. Pre-packaged donuts, frozen ones, ready-made baked goods, all of it meant that people were far less interested in doing basic home baking the usual. Nowadays even, if someone does want to get cooking, they usually think about something that can at least get a couple of views. Beef and cottage cheese loaf is a practical dish packed full of protein that was almost ideal for the lifestyle of the average American in the middle of the 20th century. It's not something you find anymore, but it was an ingenious way to stretch out your ground beef stock further while still making something delicious out of it. Plus, this is one of the few cases where you see what cheese can really do for a dish, besides just being a really nice topping. The moisture, texture, and nutritional value went up considerably thanks to the combination, and while it may seem pretty standard today, I mean, beef and cheese, really? It was actually something that was challenging norms back in the day. It made perfect sense when you placed it in the context of wartime rationing. Unlike a typical meatloaf, this used curds of cottage cheese to help keep the dish bonded together. It was a perfect meal for large families or people who were expecting more and more additions to theirs, and as you know, that was a lot of people back then. Savory beefcake is a lot lesser known, but its significance in history can't be understated. This is also one of the few items we have that actually dates back to the Victorian era. Back then, meat-based puddings were all the rage alongside sweat cakes. These were really dense cakes that were filled to the brim with protein. They had shredded beef, eggs, ground beef, and sweat or lard, and it made for a very dense, compact loaf, and some versions decided to take it up a few notches more. They would throw in warm spices, gravy, and mushroom stock, give this dish an earthy umami flavor with some sweet undertones. It was particularly beloved in rural households and working-class families simply because it was extremely hard to finish. Not because the dish tasted bad or anything, but it was just that filling. Savory beefcake declined by the 20th century because most people were starting to focus on lighter dishes, but for long journeys where you need something that really fills you up. If you think about it, pickled beef balls were really just as old-fashioned. They were born out of a preservation technique that basically combined chopped beef with vinegar, salt, and some spices that were then cured in a briny liquid. This was done so that the meat would last a lot longer than it usually could, and it was likely something that came out of pickled meat traditions stemming from Europe. German Sauerfleisch and the Jewish dish pickled tongue have some pretty strong resemblance to this dish. The acidity of the vinegar would do more than just preserve the meat. It would also be wonderful at tenderizing the meat so that you could actually use cheaper cuts of meat. Most rural families could not afford premium cuts because of how expensive they were, but nobody really liked eating chewy, tough, rubber-like meat. These pickled beef balls were an easy solution, and one that you could make in a batch for a rainy day. Meat potato candy is a very strange dish. It's incredibly practical, it's very economical, and it comes out of a time where those two things were all that people wanted in their food. It's something we can thank the Depression and wartime periods for. It was back then that families were stretching things and making nutrient-dense treats out of literally whatever they could find. barter or grow. The dish was something that took some American classics and put them together very nicely. You had mashed potatoes, ground beef, which was usually pork or beef, but even bologna would do, and then you had sugar. Sometimes people would spare a bit of flour so that this could be binded properly. Now most people would also prefer their candy to be like a typical toffee, but times were tough. The idea behind the candy was more practical than it was fun anyway. This time, people thought that they would make a calorically dense dish that would be easy to carry around in their pockets and bags instead of needing separate storage. It would also be high in energy, so it would be like an instant pick-me-up. In that regard, I think they did pretty great. Would you use it the same way at work? Bologna burger bakes were actually a part of mid-century home economics creativity. It was thanks to the advent of processed food becoming such a widespread thing. Bologna, Spam, and hot dogs were all incorporated into everyday meals in many different kinds of ways. This dish was something that involved thick rounds of bologna, and it was mixed with all sorts of different kinds of seasonings. People particularly loved what paprika and bay leaves could do for the dish. They thought it added a spicy kick to the first few bites that dissolved very nicely. Once the dish had established itself as a powerhouse of the 1950s, it was slowly starting to become something you would see in dorms, in homes, parties, and just something your teenagers would be messing around with. It helped that it was such a nice and affordable source of protein, and that Bo Logan was already becoming perceived as a burger substitute. Ground beef was still expensive thanks to all the rationing, and home cooks thought that if they couldn't get that regularly, they may as well get to repurposing. Fruit and meat casseroles have actually existed for the better part of a few centuries. They've blended sweet, savory flavors in a lot of different ways, and they were even considered luxurious at one point. In medieval Europe, you would often find people pairing fruit with meat. In Native American culture, you can find dishes like pemmican, which are incredible superfoods. In the 19th and 20th century, you can find all sorts of references to fruit and meat-based combinations in Southern and Midwestern American cooking. Pork and apples, ham and pineapple pizza, the list goes on and on. This dish was a casserole that a lot of people were divided about, though. The thing with these savory fruit and meat dishes is that how well they work changes depending on what the format is. The decline of fruit and meat casseroles in the 70s and after that was influenced by how people were shifting their tastes away from casseroles in general, especially out-of-the-box combinations like this. These were also seen as overly sweet over time, and they didn't manage to keep up with the trend of wanting lighter, softer, and easier food. Spam. Beef hash is a budget-friendly dish that came out during the times where people had literally nothing to work with. The name of the game was stretching whatever bits and pieces of meat you had for as long as you possibly could. This happened to just be the best tool available for doing that, and man, it was seriously efficient. Hash itself was just a chopped and fried mixture of different kinds of meat scraps, potatoes, and onions. It actually goes back several centuries, and the addition of Spam and beef together was something that was a World War II innovation. Spam was something that became a household staple mostly due to the shelf life it had and the incredible amount of affordability. It was something you could also mix in with other kinds of meats to make these hybrid dishes. I'm not talking about meat bits, but actual cuts of meat. Most Spam beef hash recipes had very staple ingredients that everyone was used to, but it was the convenience of having everything packed like that in such a neat little format. Nowadays, Spam's actually making a return thanks to how expensive food in general has become. Beefy bread pudding was supposed to be a savory spin on a traditional bread pudding. You know, throw in some imagination and fun in there for the sake of it. It originated as a way to actually get rid of stale bread. You'll notice that throughout this list, people found a lot of uses for stale bread. Now, we would probably just throw it out, but most people thought that there was no need to waste something that could still be made into a decent dish. In the early 20th century in America, beefy bread pudding started to evolve into a casserole-style dish because that was just a far more convenient way of making it. The shift we have towards the end of the 20th century towards lighter meals and smaller portions is because individualized eating really became a thing. People could literally order whatever they wanted, specialized, processed, and canned to their every craving. Back in the start of the 20th century, meals still had to be made with respect to how good they were at feeding the whole family. Beefy bread pudding happened to be pretty damn good at doing that, especially when it comes with mashed potatoes as a side or some gravy. Ground beef mayo loaf was a home cooking experiment that came out when mayonnaise started to become popular. I know that might seem like a shock to you because we've grown up exclusively in a world where mayonnaise and ketchup were like the only possible options for a sandwich off of the top of your head. But mayonnaise didn't always have that kind of top dog reputation. Meatloaves themselves have been around for many centuries, but the addition of mayonnaise to the mixture was something that came out in the 50s and 60s exclusively. It was promoted in community cookbooks too, and brands also wanted to highlight how good their mayonnaise was in different kinds of dishes, so they would pay for space in these cookbooks. Plus, mayonnaise is pretty dense calorically, so it fills you up. Now, a typical loaf looks like crushed crackers, eggs, Worcestershire sauce, and a lot of different seasonings, as well as a grated cheese and onion soup mix. They even had pickle relish thrown in there, and the loaf would have a mayonnaise glaze on top as well, mixed with mustard or barbecue sauce. Cornflake-coated meatballs were a really good example of mid-century breading techniques. They were inspired by the rise of cereals as a cooking ingredient. People hadn't really imagined the potential of cereal as a coating, yet only as a breakfast. That kind of wacky experimentation is something that took place more so in the 60s and 50s. It was also thanks to cereal companies trying to market their products that way. They thought that they would simply get more bang for their buck if they marketed their products as something that you could have for breakfast and lunch instead of just one or the other. And I think they were right. These cornflake-coated meatballs ended up becoming national sensations. Food trends did shift just a decade or two later, but they were still very, very popular retro recipes that made for perfect party food. They could be baked or fried either, so you could switch it up with each serving, or you could just do a half-and-half platter. Also, depending on what kind of flavors you were working with in the cereal, you could actually just make some pretty interesting combinations and variations. Ground beef coffee stew was something that really highlighted just how imaginative the Depression era really was. I mean, seriously, can you imagine people actually making use out of coffee grounds? It was a way for people to stretch simple ingredients as far as they could, even just to slightly make the beef taste a bit richer and better. This had a double effect, though. It would not just work as a seasoning, it would also work as a tenderizer. The same way wine and beer is used to really tenderize tough cuts of meat. In cowboy cooking, this was one of the most popular dishes you could ever make. Strong and black coffee would be poured into pot roasts and gravies. It was so good because you could pretty much just make whatever out of this on the road. You didn't even really need to have a concrete ground beef recipe you were following. You could just mash them into balls, put them into a pot, stir it with the coffee, and you'd be done. People would add molasses and tomatoes, but if you ever wanted to cook around a campfire and all you had was a can of ground beef and some coffee, then this is the ideal dish to go for. Cabbage and beef pudding is something that was considered a very hearty and old-fashioned dish that evolved from British and Eastern European meat puddings. Sweat, breadcrumbs, and grains were often used to bind the meat and vegetables together, so it makes sense that they took the same inspiration from there. Now, the end result was usually a steamed or baked dish, but this was a pudding that became a working-class staple. Cabbage was an ingredient that was really precious to the working class overall. It was one of the few things they could enjoy year-round. It was easy to store, did not spoil, and it could be used in sandwiches or gravies and puddings like this. Boiled cabbage leaves would be used as a wrapping for the beef, and it was actually a pretty nice little meal you could serve to the family. Of course, the kids would need a lot more convincing, because leafy greens aren't any kid's idea of a fun time, but it's not like they'd always say no. Over time, though, the country definitely started to say no a lot more frequently. This dish was seen as rustic, too much for the preference of the majority in America, but it's really refreshing and crunchy that's good once in a while. Beef gelatin molds were an example of just how obsessed the 50s and 60s could be with gelatin-based dishes. Remember the way I talked about how aspics were really just the culmination of people's preference for gelatin dishes? This was one of the best recipes that came out of all that. It was considered elegant and practical, two things you rarely find in one recipe. The concept of meat in gelatin actually goes back to the medieval times, though. Meat jellies and aspics were used as a popular way of food preservation instead of refrigeration, which, well, was a few centuries of. In the 50s and 60s, while refrigeration was still becoming a national convenience, people started to experiment with beef gelatin. They were influenced by how popular Knox and Jell-O were becoming, and it made people want to try out other different things and see what they could do with their food too. Now, they were mostly an outdated preference by the time of the 80s and 70s because people just got over the hype. But while they were there, they were a pretty phenomenal way to have meat. It was an experience that really broadened people's horizons to what a savory dish could be. Meat stuffed apples are a very forgotten dish. They're actually one with an incredible amount of history, though. I know you've heard of baked apples stuffed with prunes or raisins or coated in honey and all that stuff, but meat is definitely uncharted territory for us. Back in the medieval times, it was still a lot more common. It was a combination of fruit and meat, which people typically thought of as a luxury. Of course, it was a dish that was hard to make and took a decent amount of skill. It really wasn't easy to hollow out so many apples and serve them up on a platter, and you had to be meticulously precise about the filling because you didn't want to puncture the apples and ruin the presentation. Then there was all the spices, so this dish was definitely labor-intensive, but man, was it a labor of love. This was something that people used to go crazy over in the autumn season, and it was something that was always very beloved and well-received in places with a high density of apple orchards. Even as culinary trends began to shift, it still remained a regional favorite in places where apples had always been a prized part of the cuisine. Ground beef and oat fudge is something that's literally blasphemy if you treat it by today's standards, but it's something that really fits within what you would call Depression-era food. It was a creative way to use meat, especially as far as sweet dishes were considered, and the idea of making beef together with oats and chocolate might have come out of dishes like suet puddings, where the meat was used for texture more than it was used for flavor. Still, those are different dishes. Most versions of ground beef and oat fudge were pretty controversial. They were made by finely grounding the beef or boiling it and then mixing it with cocoa powder, sugar, oats, and butter, and sometimes with sweetened and condensed milk or eggs. Some recipes even went as far as including vanilla in it or cinnamon so that the lingering flavor of meat could be masked and it would not be overly gamey. The fudge was also pressed into a pan and chilled and sliced, but the dish was not something most people ate out of preference. It was just really efficient at filling you up and giving you a decent amount of protein. A savory ice cream with ground beef is probably the best way to end this list. The entire time, we've had unconventional, imaginative dishes that really break the definition of what should count as a savory dish. I mean, you grow up thinking all ground beef belongs in a casserole or a taco, and then you find out people used to be eating ice cream with it, hell, even making it with the stuff. The idea of ground beef ice cream is, historically speaking, definitely one of the more extreme culinary experiments. It became a really popular thing during times where people were experimenting with cooking, and while it might be really strange to us today, it actually checks out historically. For the longest time, dairy and protein have always gone together, and custards, liver pâtés, and even early versions of mincemeat pies were things that were always considered sweet and savory. The most common version of a ground beef ice cream was something that involved ground or pureed beef, and that would be blended into a cream or milk-based mixture right before it would be churned. Recipes also relied on beef broth or consomme, while others used aspic or honey and caramelized onions. It was a lot like modern-day bacon ice creams if you think about it. Home cooks also experimented with all sorts of unusual ingredients, and while ground beef was always considered a niche, underground experiment, it did do fairly well for how out-of-the-box it is. The classic beef and potato casserole. Reminds me of a time when 40-step recipes from Instagram didn't exist, and it was all about simplicity and comfort. The layers of browned ground beef, golden potatoes, and a creamy sauce could warm even the coldest hearts. Topped with a generous amount of cheese, of course, because when you're at Grandma's, more cheese equals more love. Why was this dish suddenly forgotten? Maybe it's because all of the new recipes call for superfoods and gluten-free alternatives, which this casserole is definitely not. It's a classic, old-school ground beef dish. The magic of beef and potato casserole lies in its simplicity. It's basically just a few staple ingredients thrown together and baked until bubbly. No fuss. It's hearty and delicious. Plus, who doesn't love a meal where everything is combined into one pan? Less cleanup means more time in front of the TV watching your favorite 80s sitcom. Seconds are almost always guaranteed, so you could also say that this dish is perfect for meal stretches and it's budget-friendly. To start off, the classic roast beaver tail. Now, I know this one sounds a tad bit unusual right off the bat, but this meaty meal was once a cornerstone of survival for Native Americans and early settlers. Imagine this, trading a juicy steak for a flat, scaly beaver tail. But hey, survival is survival. They said it tasted like pork rinds, so maybe it wasn't as bad as it sounds. Beaver tails were roasted over an open flame until the skin was crisp and the fat underneath rendered down. Beavers were a crucial resource for Native American tribes, and they didn't let any part of the rodent go to waste, not even the tails. Roast beaver tail wasn't just sustenance. It was a delicacy among American Indians and trappers. The best part? It wasn't just finger-licking delicious, but also provided a high-energy meal for those braving the frontier. The 1970s saw the rise and dominance of the timeless lobster thermidor, a dish that still has all the best restaurants in the world using it to prove they're worth every little best of your money. It has a long history of being a status symbol, one that represents all kinds of indulgence and wealth, from fancy night outs that you saved up for to the finest meals on cruise liners. You might not know, though, that lobster thermidor actually has a lot of French history to it. The dish used to be a luxury dining item since well before it ever made a name for itself in America. After the 50s, people had begun to explore continental dining experiences more, and this was particularly common amongst the upper middle class. They loved themselves a good thermidor, if nothing else. Now, I know you all think lobsters can be a bit of a chore to eat sometimes, but they're 10 times more of a headache to make too, and even more expensive to get. You had to employ some real skilled chefs to make something out of a good Maine lobster, so only the rich could afford the outrageous prices some menus would charge. In the 70s, lobster thermidor was something you would see in gourmet prix-fixe menus, which would often cost more than $80 per couple. No worries. Don't confuse regular old boring meatloaf with this special Dutch oven meatloaf with crackers. No, don't get your wires crossed, it's definitely different. Back in the day, Grandma really knew how to jazz things up and make this classic into something unexpected, just by adding some crackers. When crackers are added to the mix, they become like little sponges full of flavor, absorbing juices and adding to the texture of the dish. But this still doesn't really make it that different from the regular meatloaf. So where does the difference lie? Well, it lies in the Dutch oven baking. This oven, or pot as some might say, locks in flavor and moisture like nothing you've ever seen before. The result? A tender, savory meatloaf with a perfectly crisp outer layer. And Grandma knew how to serve it right, with a thick layer of ketchup glaze on top. Because sometimes, more is more. Plus, when you add a side of mashed potatoes, it'll be like you're biting into nostalgia. Back in the Great Depression, meatloaf was a go-to because it stretched a small amount of beef into a meal for the whole family. And crackers were cheaper than breadcrumbs, and we all know Grandma knows how to save some bucks. Today, it's almost entirely forgotten as chicken has taken over the dinner table. Jellied eels were a staple on the dinner table back in the 1900s. This dish was whipped up in London in the 18th century, when a bored chef decided to mix things up a bit. Here's the thing. Eels were dirt cheap back in the day, so they were everyone's favorite source of meat. The dish consisted of chopped eels boiled in a spiced stock and allowed to cool and set, forming a jelly. It was usually served cold and made a good substitute for dessert. Since it was light on the pockets, the English loved to serve it at dinner parties and festivals. It also made its way out to other parts of Europe such as Denmark and Sweden, which came up with their own versions of the jelly. You won't find a lot of people talking about jellied eels now, because it has largely disappeared from the British menus. Now, if you had a fat pocket back then and seafood wasn't up your alley, you could go to the best luxury hotels and try out their shimmering restaurants. Or you could spend your time sipping wine in the finest steakhouse America had to offer at the time. Made from the center cut of the best beef tenderloins around, it was definitely what you could call a display of wealth. Plus, this is one I get. If I had the money to burn, I'd definitely go for this steak too. There's nothing that beats that yummy tenderness. Plus, it was always an experience too, you know? You had a whole maitre d' there to carve it for you and only you, and that really added to the whole vibe. Chateaubriand was always a thick roast too, so whenever they'd slice it, they would usually be serving it for two. That meant it was one of the most romantic dinners you could have, so these steakhouses were pretty busy around this time in February back in the 70s. You'd also be paying for the amazing sauces you would get with this, such as the béarnaise sauce. It made the whole thing come together in a way I can't even begin to describe to you. I know some of you aren't fond of soupy dishes, but please hear me out. Beef paprikash. It sounds complicated to make, but I know your grandma, just like mine, made it without batting an eye. Imagine tender beef simmered in a rich paprika-infused sauce, bursting with smoky and spicy flavors. This dish is like goulash's cousin, wouldn't you say? Beef paprikash is a traditional Hungarian dish where it was a hit in kitchens where spices were basically like family heirlooms. But, contrary to popular beliefs here in the United States, paprikash is traditionally made without beef or macaroni noodles. Shocking, right? Its origins date back to the 9th century Magyar shepherds as a simple meat and onion stew prepared in heavy iron kettles known as bograks. In the 15th century, invading Ottoman Turks introduced a new spice to Hungary, paprika. While the rest of Europe remained lukewarm towards this red chili pepper from the New World, Hungary embraced it, and paprika has since become a defining element of Hungarian cuisine. Paprikash is kind of in between a soup and a stew. Unlike some stews, paprikash is not overly packed full of beef and vegetables. It is a little more brothy. But through the cooking process, the broth becomes a little thicker and very rich in flavor. And here's another fun fact for you. Paprika is actually made from dried bell peppers and has been around since the 16th century. And if you thought paprika was just for sprinkling on deviled eggs, think again. But hey, if you're ever feeling adventurous enough, I say give this one a try. Straight out of the royal family's dinner table, beef Wellington was a beef steak dish with the perfect regal twist. This delicacy was made of a tender beef fillet coated with pâté and duxelles, then wrapped in puff pastry, which made it just as fancy as it sounds. It was traditionally served with a rich red wine sauce, such as a Madeira or Cabernet Sauvignon reduction. Now, the origin of this meal is shrouded in history, but it is suggested that it emerged in England in the 19th century and was named after the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. This steak required a lot of time and patience, which made it a meal for only the royals of England. It's a part of ancient history now, but you might be able to taste it if you make your way to Regal Balls or a Michelin star restaurant in London. By the 70s, Tornados Rossini had made its own name in steakhouse culture, and it was one that no one would be forgetting anytime soon. All kinds of decadent steak dishes went and came throughout the history of America's culinary phases, but this one was something that was always popular among old money. It wasn't exactly something that I would say was as popular as Chateaubriand, but it was definitely something that was a really well-regarded meal among people who were fine dining professionals. It was something that was basically known for being benign as over the top. It was something that had grand as its middle name, and it was even named after a famous Italian composer from the 19th century, Gioacchino Rossini. It was something that screamed, "I'm rich," to everyone that eyed your waiter as they came to serve you. It combined all kinds of rare ingredients too. You had filet mignon, foie gras, Madeira, and wine, which were all really luxury imports. French cuisine was something that was considered the absolute peak of culinary sophistication, and Tornados Rossini was one of the most over-the-top things you could get for yourself. As far as pricing went, each cruise ship and luxury hotel had their own price ranges, but you could expect to pay anywhere between $60 to $100 back then for an entire course, which is definitely a lot. Now, another dish that originated from Europe: stuffed kohlrabi. This traditional Hungarian dish features bulbs of kohlrabi stuffed with a flavorful pork and rice filling and served alongside a kohlrabi soup made with leftover scraps and greens. I know it doesn't sound very appealing, but if you're adventurous, it's worth a shot. But what is kohlrabi? Popular in Northern and Eastern Europe, kohlrabi is sometimes called a German turnip. Kohlrabi may look like an alien creature, but if you've never tried it, you're in for a treat. It has a texture similar to broccoli, but it's sweeter and not quite as smelly. Stuffed kohlrabi is a very traditional Hungarian dish, but there's no one single way to make it. Much like Italians and their marinara, every family will have their own different version of it, with different meats. Some feature beef instead of pork, or a mix of the two, as well as many different stuffings and seasonings. But this one is particularly unique in that it uses all vegetables, including greens. It makes its own side dish by pureeing the greens and leftover pulp from the hollowed-out bulbs into a gorgeously green, flavorful soup. Brilliant, right? Imagine a cake recipe that makes its own frosting or something. That would be sick, am I right? Or am I right? Kohlrabi has a mild, slightly sweet flavor, kind of like a cross between a cabbage and a turnip. Once stuffed, these little guys were baked until tender, with the beefy filling bubbling away inside. If your grandma was making kohlrabi, just know that she was way ahead of her time, since it can perfectly fit into today's low-carb keto lifestyle. Pressed duck, a French-inspired masterpiece, is just as complex as it sounds. The dish involves cooking a duck and then using a special press to extract the blood and juices, which are then used to create a rich, flavorful sauce. You heard that right? A sauce made out of blood and bone marrow. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this dish was a showstopper at French restaurants back in the day, and its unique taste spoke for itself. The complex dish was a specialty of Rouen, and its creation was attributed to an innkeeper from the city of Duclair. It's also known as canard à la presse, and is a specialty of the Tour d'Argent restaurant in Paris. Cooking pressed duck isn't a job for the weak and requires special time and effort, which is exactly why it has become a rare dinner time on our tables now. And then, of course, not everyone has a knack for eating a sauce made out of bone marrow. Dover sole meunière can be defined completely in the word perfect. No, really, this dish isn't something that is extravagant because it wants to be, because it has some image to maintain or rich clients to attract. This is a dish that is what it is because it has to be. It's something that you first of all just cannot make without the absolute finest ingredients available. From the Dover sole fish, which is an incredibly rare catch, to the meunière sauce, and the accompanying pomme de terre chateau, each and every ingredient that was placed in this dish was there because it was the best thing that the restaurant could find. Nothing less would suffice. Not only that, you had to have incredible technique to handle the fish, otherwise you'd very easily just spoil it. That's why only the finest and most seasoned chefs got to cook this. By the way, all of this is assuming the fish is caught locally, because if you went for places that were serving authentic, imported North Atlantic Dover, then you were getting charged a hefty premium. Only the most elite French restaurants and continental places served it, and it was known as something exclusively upper class. Shepherd's pie, the cozy blanket of food. This classic comfort food originated with the clever idea of layering leftover ground beef with mashed potatoes. Shepherd's pie is believed to have been invented in the early 1800s. During this time, housewives were struggling to find innovative ways to recycle the leftovers that their husbands and kids had turned up their noses at. Now, buckle up for a brief history lesson. The British and some of the Protestant Irish converts became the new rulers, while Irish Catholics who refused to convert became peasant farm workers living in humble homes referred to as cottages. Around 1589, Sir Walter Raleigh introduced potato farming to Ireland, and over time, potatoes gained acceptance in Ireland since they were not only delicious, but also affordable for the poor. Towards the end of the 18th century, a new dish known as cottage pie came about. It is believed that it originated as a way for women to make use of the leftovers to avoid food wastage. After making the delicious weekend roast, all unused meat was carefully repurposed into a pie using affordable potatoes as a crust. Shepherd's pie became one of the best ways to deal with leftover meat. As an added bonus, it was, and still is, extremely delicious. Before chicken became everyone's favorite pie stuffing, rabbit pie was a favorite on the Easter table. Made out of tender rabbit meal, this savory pie was a household favorite in many rural areas. Rabbit meat is not only rich in flavor, but it's full of nutrients, which made this a healthy choice for many and a staple of the American pioneers. Plus, rabbit meat didn't cost a fortune like most meat back in the day and was widely available. Along with rabbit meat, ingredients of the filling of a rabbit pie typically included onions, celery, and carrots. Some English variations included prunes, bacon, and cider, while the Australians sometimes included the food paste Vegemite. Rabbits aren't as common as they were back then, so rabbit pie has vanished from our tables and Easter traditions. You know what? All good things come to an end. Filet mignon au poivre, or more easily known as peppercorn-crusted filet mignon, was this rich steak that came in a cognac or brandy-infused cream sauce, and yeah, this was just like the rest. All of these dishes were absolutely the priciest things you could get, and scaled to today's rates, we're talking about hundreds or even thousands of dollars on food alone. The filet mignon was simply considered that much of a luxury. It was cut right from the center of the tenderloin, and the melt-in-your-mouth feeling that came as a result of that extreme tenderness was something rich people had no issues shilling out hundreds of dollars for. Plus, the 70s were a big time for all things boozy, and that meant food with more than just spices in it. The cognac people used for these was also top of the line, so just about every aspect of it was made to fit the palates and taste buds of the uber elite. Even if you saved up for this, the amount of money and time spent would just not really make sense unless you had someone's paycheck to burn through on a casual whim. Moving on to something that is American-made, Salisbury steak, seasoned ground beef patties, pan-seared to perfection, and then smothered in a rich onion-loaded gravy. What's not to like? I bet most of you haven't heard the backstory of Salisbury steak, so let me educate you. It is best known as a staple of TV dinners and bargain buffets. The Salisbury steak actually has its beginnings as a proposed cure for digestive illness during the Civil War. If you didn't know, digestive illnesses killed more soldiers during the Civil War than combat did, and a diet rich in beefsteak and coffee was one suggested cure. The inventor of the Salisbury steak, Dr. James Henry Salisbury, was an early pioneer of germ theory and of diet being a factor in health. While some of his ideas may be outdated today, his affection for beefsteak and his promotion of its positive effect on health have persisted. While patties of ground beef are common fare, the Salisbury steak was cemented in the American lexicon during World War I. In many English-speaking countries, there was a movement to limit the use of German-sounding words, so the Army served Salisbury steak rather than Hamburg steak and Liberty sandwiches instead of hamburgers. Sure, it may not be the health trend it once was, but let's be honest, it's a comfort food icon for a reason. Now, the French weren't fans of the rabbit pie, so they decided to whip up a pigeon pie instead. This delicacy dates all the way back to the 17th century when James Hart, a Scottish physician, wrote in 1633 that pigeon pies were usually served with far too much pepper. It became an instant hit after Hart's paper, and people started cutting down on the pepper a bit. This crispy dish was a savory game pie made of pigeon meat and various other ingredients traditional to French cuisine. The buttery crust made it a luxurious treat which was common on banquet tables. It was a tradition for wives to make pigeon pie after their husbands spent long days hunting for the delicious bird. But hey, tastes change, and so do our feathered friends. By the 1970s, poussin was something that was available at almost every kind of high-end French restaurant. What would really go well with it was the truffle butter, which is arguably half the reason all those fancy bigwigs ever even came to those places. Catering exclusively to the tastes of gourmands and the upper class, the dish featured young spring chicken, which was basically just chicken that had been slaughtered at around 3 to 4 weeks old. This meant that it was a lot more tender and delicate, but that's also just ever so slightly macabre. Either way, the incredible mix of the truffle butter along with the poussin really brought out the best in both. I wouldn't say this is a dish that did as well as some of its other beef alternatives on the list, but it's definitely something that sold out more than a few tables. People came for the velvety texture of the chicken and stayed for the aromatic flavor of the butter. Hey, some rich people didn't exactly feel like lamb or beef was their thing. You might go up a few tax brackets, but if you're a chicken liver, that's not changing anytime soon. Johnny Marzetti might just be the ultimate comfort food you've been missing out on. It's an old-school casserole that was once a staple in Midwestern kitchens, but has since fallen off the radar for many. Imagine this: a bubbling, cheesy dish of noodles, tender ground beef, and zesty tomato sauce, all baked together in a warm, gooey hug. It's basically the casserole version of a cozy sweater on a chilly day. This dish has an interesting backstory. Created in the early 1900s at Marzetti's restaurant in Columbus, Ohio, it was named after the brother of the restaurant's owner, Teresa Marzetti. Word has it that Johnny Marzetti became so popular it spread like wildfire across homes, schools, and church potlucks throughout the Midwest. It was affordable, easy to make, and could feed a crowd. What's not to love? What makes Johnny Marzetti so special is how adaptable it is. Want to throw in some veggies like peppers or mushrooms? Go for it. Craving a little extra kick? Add some crushed red pepper or Italian seasoning. And if you're a cheese lover, and who isn't, feel free to go overboard with layers of mozzarella, cheddar, or parmesan. The best part? It tastes even better the next day as leftovers when all the flavors have had time to mingle and marry. Ever wondered what the ultimate American comfort food was back in the day? Well, the only right answer is the veal and ham pie. This hearty pie combined the delicate flavors of veal with the salty goodness of ham. The pie's popularity surged during the Victorian era. It originated in the kitchens of English settlers and was a practical choice for using up leftovers, but soon became a meal for the elite. While it was a luxurious delicacy in England, it was a staple in large households in America. Not only was it easy to whip up, but was also cheap to make, which made it perfect for communal gatherings and large families. If you want to give your grandparents a rush of nostalgia, ask them about this meaty goodness, and who knows, your grandma might even dust off some cookbooks. So, people used to think the best way to enjoy supper was to get some hash browns from a local diner. But if your grandpa made the right choices in life and as a result you now sip on caviar for fun, you would be more interested in something like terrine de foie gras. This was something that was a big part of gourmand culture all throughout the early 20th century. And it was something that saw a spike in popularity after the war had ended. French haute cuisine was the apex predator in the fine dining restaurant scene, especially in big boy cities like New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The dish itself was definitely one of the hallmark recipes of its time, being nothing less than absolute extravagance. It was something you'd associate with high society, with people who had big gates and the latest Porsche or something. Even food connoisseurs were amazed at how well the dish had fit into the American palate, despite how it was not something that you would typically see in an American menu at all, but that just goes to show how much times changed right after the wars had ended. Cabbage rolls are one of those dishes that instantly make my heart melt. It reminds me of my childhood and weekends away at Grandma's, with the house reeking of cabbage, but nobody minded. Cabbage rolls are proof that Grandma could take a humble vegetable and turn it into something magical. Picture this: tender cabbage leaves wrapped around a savory filling of seasoned ground beef and rice. Once baked, the cabbage turned silky, and each bite was an explosion of comforting flavors. And the best part? Cabbage rolls were even better the next day. But this dish has its variations all around the world. Although the direct heritage of cabbage rolls cannot be certain, its lineage can be traced back to Jewish cooking 2,000 years ago. Here are a few variations, and hopefully some of them will get you to try cabbage rolls, if you haven't already. In Bulgaria, it's called sarmi, made with veal, pork, chopped mint, sweet paprika, and yogurt. And in Russia, it's called golubtsi. The Russian version of cabbage rolls usually consists of cooked meatballs wrapped in cabbage leaves. Rice is commonly added to the stuffing as well, but stuffing the rolls with rice only is rare, generally served with sour cream. But whichever version of cabbage rolls you decide to try, you won't be sorry. Squirrel stew might sound unusual today, but it was a popular dish in rural areas. Yep, our bushy-tailed friends were once a common ingredient in many kitchens. Also known as Brunswick stew, it was a tomato-based stew generally involving local beans, vegetables, and originally small game meat such as squirrel. However, many variations from around the world used rabbit meat too. The origin of this meaty stew is controversial at best, as the states of Virginia and Georgia both claim its birth, with Brunswick County in Virginia and the city of Brunswick in Georgia claiming it was developed there. To keep things peaceful, let's just say Virginia and Georgia both played a role in creating this delicious stew. Squirrel meat was easily hunted and provided a necessary source of protein. With the rise of chicken, squirrel stew has fallen out of flavor. But hey, this one is pretty easy to whip up and will satisfy your Thursday night meat cravings like no other. If you ever wanted to try some saddle of venison, then you could go to any number of steakhouses and fine dining continental restaurants in many states. Some of these, like Le Pavillon and Maison Robert, made a name for themselves as being one of the best places to go to if you wanted French food done right. Others, like La Caravelle and the 21 Club, were easily some of the best places to go for if what you were looking for was a very well-made steak. Either way, it was something you would find only where the cats with the biggest piles of gold would come to play. You know, at Maison Robert, it wasn't just damn good venison they were selling. You even got wild boar there. Basically, this dish was meant for all things special and memorable, and if you really wanted to go all out either for yourself or someone else, then you could definitely just do this because it was probably the safest choice amongst all of them. The venison saddle was really something that elevated venison and what it could do for you, as well as opening people's minds to more venison-based dishes. Now, to trace back to the all-American dishes. Next up, Sloppy Joe's. If there's one ground beef dish that screams childhood, it's Sloppy Joe's. The magic started with browning the beef, then stirring in a tangy, slightly sweet sauce made of ketchup, mustard, and maybe a splash of Worcestershire sauce. Spooned onto a soft, squishy bun, the result was a messy masterpiece that made you glad napkins were invented. The concept of mixing meat, cheese, and bread is so simple that it shouldn't come as a surprise that it became an American favorite. The Sloppy Joe's history is a bit complex, though. Some say that the original Sloppy Joe came from a cafe in Sioux City, Iowa, where many years ago, in 1930, a cook named Joe added tomato sauce to his loose meat sandwiches. And voila, a new recipe was invented. Others say that the original sandwich was born at the iconic restaurant in Key West, Florida, Sloppy Joe's Bar. But wherever it originated from, the loose meat sandwiches are still very much a culinary tradition, especially in Iowa. If you think the beef heart is off limits for cuisine, you're wrong, because stuffed hearts were once a celebrated dish. This dish sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it was actually quite common. Think of the beef heart cleaned, stuffed with a mixture of breadcrumbs, herbs, and often pine nuts or raisins, and then roasted or braised. Sounds appetizing yet? This economical and tasty meal was a testament to the nose-to-tail philosophy of cooking, where no part of the animal was wasted. In Europe, the practice of stuffing animal hearts dates back to medieval times. It was a popular dish amongst the working class in England, while it was reserved for the elite in France. Eating hearts isn't as common today, but if you ever tried this one, you'd understand the hype. Langoustines in 1970s. America were known as Norway lobsters, and they were something that could easily come into the definition of exotic. It was a little different from your standard lobster, since it was its own separate area of American food culture. Langoustines had one thing about them, though. They were very rare, and you couldn't even catch them in the country. Any langoustines that restaurants use were all imported from Europe abroad. These crustaceans were known for being the most tender and buttery food along, and the scarcity and resulting high price only added to the luxury item feel for rich people. The way the upper class works is if you can prove a bigger point by charging more money, they'll gladly pay you more. At the end of the day, it looks even better if, say, they paid $150 instead of $100, right? The reason langoustines aren't something you see anymore is because it became hard to import them from Scotland and Ireland because of their really perishable nature. They had to be shipped live or they had to be flash frozen, and that made them a lot more expensive and costly than they originally were. Most places decided it wasn't worth it to spend so much on something that only a small portion of their client base paid for. Another staple of our United States cuisine, beef and bean chili. Ooh, my grandma knew how to make that chili right. This wasn't the watery, mild stuff you might get from a can. No, this was a thick, hearty, beef and bean-packed chili that stuck to your ribs and made you forget about the cold weather outside. Ground beef, kidney beans, tomatoes, and a fiery blend of spices. Grandma's secret weapon was always a dash of chili powder and maybe a little cocoa powder if she was feeling fancy. Simmered to perfection, the rich, meaty sauce soaked into every bite. And the beans? Well, they weren't just filler. They added a creamy texture that balanced the beefy goodness. Whether served with cornbread, crackers, or just a dollop of sour cream on top, Grandma's chili could warm even the coldest of souls. Now, you might have noticed how I'm trying to avoid mentioning the origins of chili. And if you're from the south of the United States, you probably know why. Chili has roots in the American Southwest, but variations can be found all over the country. Some swear by no beans, which may come as a shocker, I know, but at Grandma's beans were a must. They made the chili stretch further, which meant more leftovers, because the only thing better than chili is day-old chili. Ground beef recipes have always been a dream. Comment down below which recipe you like the most, and don't forget to like and subscribe.